think the first question for us, Andres, and I'll welcome you to the discussion here, is obviously we have an upcoming election, but it seems that Colombia is performing pretty well compared to the rest of the region. What can you tell us about the current performance from an economic perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Alec. Absolutely, Colombia is looking pretty strong right now. We've seen a strong economic rebound from the pandemic with the full recovery of pre-pandemic GDP levels in 2021. This marks one of the fastest rebounds in Latin America, up there with Chile and Brazil. And growth has really been driven by strong consumer spending, which has been bolstered by the government's expansion of stimulus spending and transfers to households, which will continue through at least the rest of 2022. Colombia is also going to be enjoying some important benefits from high global oil prices, which are going to bolster exports and oil revenue for the government this year. So all of these factors will continue to drive relatively strong growth in Colombia for 2022, basically in line with pre-pandemic growth levels, even as we encounter disruptions and downside risks, and as other countries see more substantial slowing of growth.
Perfect. No, thanks, Andres. That makes a lot of sense. And just one comment before we continue. I forgot to let our audience know that if you have questions during today's section, there is a Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen that you can submit those questions to, and we'll ensure to take 10 minutes at the end to address those. So Andres, very interesting and super interesting. We're seeing this growth as we're headed to an election that it seems like we might see a shift in governments, which you'll talk about later. But with that said, we know when it comes to the healthcare system specifically, the social security system within Colombia, what's really important is the labor market and also the fiscal outlook. Can you talk us through a little bit of about those two factors, what you're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, so on the labor market, we've also seen a relatively strong rebound with a strong spike in domestic demand really driving that labor market recovery. So the employed population right now sits less than 2% below pre-pandemic levels. And while Colombia continues to suffer from high informal employment levels, those have largely normalized compared to where we were before the pandemic. But it's not all sunshine for the Colombian economy, and the next president will definitely inherit some notable economic challenges. One of those is going to be inflation. And Colombia has not been spared from the heightened inflation that has hit the global economy recently. And in Colombia, we expect inflation to continue to rise in 2022 as disruptions from the war in Ukraine continue to elevate global commodity prices. This will dampen the consumer spending outlook and stands to drain the finances of Colombian households as time goes on. Now, for 2022, social spending and government transfers to households will act as a partial cushion against inflation, but this spending is temporary in nature, and the next president will have to determine whether or not to once again extend that spending. And amid heightened inflation, a new government is going to be unlikely to end this popular social spending, in particular in the first few months of power. So its extension is likely. However, that's going to have consequences for the government's already troubled finances. And due to the pandemic, if we go to the next slide, and the expansion of social spending, we've seen the government's finances really degrade over the past 2 years, to the point where Colombia lost its investment grade last year following the failure to adopt a comprehensive tax reform. And that's going to mean increased borrowing costs for the next government and make controlling the deficit really an urgent task. We can also see the country's really substantial deficit remains high despite a strong recovery in the broader economy, as we've discussed in 2021. Now, we've seen more recently, again, the war in Ukraine substantially raised oil prices well past the Colombian government's previous projections, which were for $70 a barrel on average for 2022. And we're now forecasting an average of 111 for 2022. So this provides some notable upside for government revenue for the months ahead. However, those fiscal benefits will be limited by low oil production levels in Colombia, which are still more than 10% below pre-pandemic levels due to underinvestment in the sector during the pandemic and also political risks, which we'll get into later. At the same time, the government's also seeking to offset the impact of inflation through subsidies and more expansions to social spending, which are also siphoning off some of this additional revenue. So All of this means that the next government will still have to deal with substantially degraded public finances, and that will require the implementation of another tax reform to really right the ship on that front. The substance and targets of the next reform will obviously depend greatly on who becomes the next president. But all this uncertainty about the government's finances and a looming tax reform are heightenings to these political risks that we're seeing with the 2022 elections. And that's taken a toll, in addition, on private investment levels. And as we've seen, the economy really rebound strongly, full rebound to pre-pandemic levels. Consumer spending also accelerate greatly during 2021. We've seen that private investment remains really well below pre-pandemic levels. And again, those political risks and those fiscal risks are really key as far as dampening that outlook. So clearly, the next government is definitely going to have some notable challenges despite this strong recovery that we've seen to the moment for Colombia.
Mhm. Yeah, no, super interesting, Andres. And if you permit me to recap there a little bit, especially connecting it back to the healthcare system. I mean, Colombia's faced fiscal challenges for several years now, and attempted several tax reforms, but they continue to prioritize healthcare. That's what we've seen. So moving forward, I think Jessica will talk a little bit about what that means for the policies under the next potential government. But you're suggesting you have two challenges. One is you have this rising inflation. Thankfully, it's not a large out-of-pocket market. It's mostly a reimbursement market, but it can impact the healthcare system, because what you're suggesting is that the government's going to have to look to subsidize consumers amongst higher inflation, and that could take away some of its fiscal capacity to address other areas and also create uncertainty from an investment perspective. So that's super interesting. We obviously have the upside, and I did some back of the calculation and back of the envelope calculations here, and it seems, I mean, you have an upside potentially of over 10 billion US dollars, just really rough, just from the increase in the oil prices, even though your production is down. I think Colombia spends somewhere around 35 billion on social security system from a healthcare perspective. So, I mean, just spending a little bit of it, there is an upside, but what you're saying is it's probably going to be limited. So that's, I think, super interesting.
Hi, my name is Krista Reganey, and I'm the Marketing Director here at FrontierView. I'd like to thank you for watching a segment of this webinar. If you'd like access to the full video and our latest insights, data, and research, sign up for a free trial with us today. Simply scan the QR code on the screen.